G'day, this is Chris Savage from RL Ministries in Australia, welcoming you to this session of the book of James. I pray that it will be of benefit to you and help you in your Christian growth. Thank you for coming along. So welcome to this session of James, where we're looking at from chapter 2, verse 25 onwards to chapter 3, verse 18. Now, in the last section, we just finished off in the last section looking, remember, James is a book where we're comparing a living faith and a dead faith, okay? Living faith produces works, dead faith doesn't produce very many works at all. And we finished off looking at the example of Abraham. Remember, Abraham, what was so special about Abraham? Well, Abraham was justified by works. What does that mean? The works were actually the evidence of his faith, evidence of his justification. And the work, what was the work that he did? Well, he offered up his son, Isaac, the son of promise. And in offering him up as a sacrifice, Abraham was justified, or he was vindicated that he really had faith in God. He trusted God. In Genesis 15, we see that Abraham was saved through faith alone. And later on in his life, in Genesis 22, Abraham's faith was now proved by his obedience to God, offer the child. So, if we step back and look at that, in Genesis 15, Abraham was justified before God. And in Genesis 22, he was then justified before men by his works. So his work supported and sustained the fact that his faith was a living faith. It was a living faith. So what prompted his obedience? His faith prompted his obedience. And so faith was at work in his actions. Faith spurred him on to do the act of offering his son, because he knew in his heart that for God to fulfill his promises to him in raising up a nation, Isaac would have had to have been resurrected from the dead to fulfill that promise. So he believed God, what God said, and so he was going to do what God asked him to do. So, and the fulfillment of that act of faith was him offering up Isaac. So Abraham's faith, what did that do for him personally? Well, it brought to completion or maturity. It brought him to completion or maturity because of that act of faith. And so therefore he was reckoned righteous. So faith, what we're saying here, what we look at here, is faith that does not produce works is not saving faith. And the reason we say that is because works actually prove the faith that saves. Remember, we're simply comparing a living faith and a dead faith. We're not talking about salvation here. It's comparing a living faith and a dead faith. A living faith produces works. A dead faith produces nothing. Okay. So this second example is the example of Rahab. We find it in chapter 2, verse 25 to 26. And again, we're looking at faith proving itself through works. It says in verse 25, and in like manner was not also Rahab the harlot justified by works, in that she received the messengers and sent them out another way. For as the body apart from the spirit is dead, even so faith apart from works is dead. So what we see here in verse 25 is James now provides an example of being justified by works. Another example. In like manner. So it means this is the second illustration. We did Abraham last session. So this is the second illustration, in like manner, Abraham being the first. So this illustration teaches the same truth. Rahab was also justified by works. Now, the Greek literally reads also, Rahab the harlot was not out of works becoming righteous. It's a funny way of saying it, isn't it? Then we have two Greek participles here following this thing. Rahab, now she was called Rahab the harlot because of her profession prior to becoming a believer. And we can see this in the book of Joshua. That's where it plays out. Joshua 2 verse 1 and Joshua 6 verse 17 and 6, 22 and 25. Also, the writer of Hebrews speaks about her in Hebrews 11:31. Now, by works, it says by works. What happened by works? Well, she proved her faith by the works that she did. Now, what did she do? Remember, she was the one who hid the two Jewish spies. She hid the messengers, and it says messengers, and then she sent them out another way. So she was being part of that city. She knew that these guys were coming to spy at the city, and so she hid them. And that specific work that she did, that proved her faith. And the work was that she received the messengers, okay? Means that she welcomed and entertained her guests. And now you got to realize that what she did was this act that she did, it actually led to an act of treason against her own people, the Canaanites of Jericho, because she recognized the men to be not only spies, but she recognized there's men to be God's messengers to her and to her family. And Joshua 2, 1-14 gives us the story here. The second participle is that she sent them out another way. Again, Joshua 2 tells us this story. And the Greek word here emphasizes it was a very energetic action. She acted with urgency and concern for their safety. God sent these two messengers to me. They're spies, but they're messengers to me and my family. And she's acting with urgency to make sure they're safe. So she sent the men out another way, not through the front entry door, but out through her window, which put them now outside the wall, because as we read, Rahab's home was on the city wall. And in verse 26, James now draws his conclusion regarding this. He says, for as the body apart from the spirit is dead, even so faith apart from works is dead. So the body, this fleshly body here, without the spirit is dead. Death takes place when there's a separation between the material part and the immaterial part of man. That's what physical death is. The spirit leaves the body and death occurs. Now, in the same way, faith without works is also dead. To separate works from faith results in a spiritually dead faith. And that's not a saving faith. Saving faith is an active faith. It is an active faith. Oh boy, now we come to the control of the tongue. This is in chapter 3, verses 1-18. And we're going to look at chapter 3, verse 1, the tongue in teaching. Now, in this verses 1-18, James is going to develop a point he established right back there in chapter 1, verse 19, where he says, you know this, my beloved brethren, let every man be swift to hear, slow to speak, slow to wrath. So we're talking about the control of the tongue. The person needs to be slow to speak, and then because of that, be slow to wrath. Now, this section here also contains the fourth test of faith, and faith is going to be tested here by developing self-control, and specifically self-control over the tongue. And a major concern here for James is the use of the tongue, because he mentions it 9 times in 4 chapters. In each of the chapters. Total of 9 times he mentions the tongue. We see it in chapter 1, verse 9 and verse 26, chapter 2, verse 12, chapter 3, verse 5 and 6 and 8, chapter 4, verse 11, and chapter 5, verse 12. All the way through, he's talking about the tongue. And let's see what he says about the tongue. He says, this is verse 1, be not many of you teachers, my brethren, knowing that we shall receive heavier judgment. Again, the expression, my brethren, tells us he's starting a new section here. And here James is now addressing teachers and their reliance on the tongue's usage. I mean, a teacher has to speak, so he's got to use his tongue. And the Greek word used here for teacher is not found anywhere else in the New Testament. This is what you call a hapax. It's the only place it's used in the New Testament. Now, here the tongue is used in the ministry of teaching. Now, James is not specifically dealing with false teaching as such. It might be included here, but not really. James' focus is focusing here on the problem of ungifted and untrained teachers. So he says, be not many of you teachers. Why? Because the teacher's work is performed primarily through the use of the tongue, through speaking. So the position as an instructor allows for the greatest misuse of the tongue in disseminating false doctrine in the church. And instructing in the public meeting of the assembly, which is a synagogue, in this instance was a synagogue, should be limited to those with the gift of teaching. And even those with that gift must be trained in properly exegeting the word of God. So the attention that James is talking about here is on public teaching in the church or the congregation, because every one of us can teach on a one-to-one basis. Every one of us can teach somebody else what we have learned. Literally, the Greek reads here, do not press yourself into the role of teaching. One needs to be sure that it is an answer to a gift. That's why you go into the teaching, because it's a gift, and the Lord has called you into that specific area. A negative imperative, it implies here that what we see here is be not. What's that negative imperative? Well, it's implying here that there was a movement by many of the people he's writing to become teachers. What he's saying is this must be stopped. Exhorting not many. James indicates that only some must assume the position of teacher, but most should not. Now, the office of teacher was roughly the equivalent of the rabbi in the Jewish community. And this would have meant that a teacher in the early Jewish Christian church would have had considerable prestige. These guys are the unofficial teachers, the didaskaloi. That's my Greek. And these were in the synagogue meetings of the church family where, there's quite a lot of latitude given for strangers to speak. The reason for many not assuming the role of teaching is knowing that we shall receive the heavier judgment. Now, notice that James here uses the first person plural. He says we. So it shows that James considered himself to be a teacher. And so he should be. He was the head of the Jerusalem church. Now, while certainly he would encourage those who have the gift to become teachers, his point is that the majority should not seek this office. Their constant use of the tongue means that they can sin very easily, leading others astray at the same time. Now, and why shouldn't they all be seeking to be teachers? Well, because all teachers are going to receive the heavier judgment. Excuse me. And notice it says will receive or shall, right? Means it's in the future. It's just a future tense, which indicates that this judgment is going to occur at the judgment seat of Christ. So the judgment for a teacher will be heavier because of his position of influence within the body of believers. Now, faith and the tongue, how do they work together? Well, several statements we're going to see here in verse 2, which is faith and the tongue. First of all, it says, for in many things we all stumble. That includes teachers. And again, James puts himself here, we all stumble. So he's including himself as among those who do fail or stumble at times. He's not perfect. And literally, the word stumble refers to, an obstacle causing someone to strike his foot and trip over it and fall. Sometimes it means a moral lapse. Figuratively, it means it's a failure in duty. It's a mistake or it's a sin. It's not a fatal flaw, but it does arrest one's progress. And the stumbling that is used here figuratively, again, it is in a failure of duty. It's a mistake or a sin which we all commit, including some teachers. And the tense here is present stumble. It's present, so it involves repeated action. So in many ways, especially in speech, we all stumble. And, back in chapter 2, verse 10, it was also used back there about speaking about failing. Remember, if they failed in one point of the law, they were guilty of the whole law, breaking the whole law, same situation. The second thing we see here is that if any man stumble not in word, the same as a perfect man. Now, again, we're talking about, the reference here is in speech, as in teaching. Now, when we speak about a perfect man, it doesn't mean that he's sinless, right? It just describes a man or woman who of having reached a goal of spiritual maturity. That's what we're talking about. When we talk about someone being perfect, it means that they have reached attained a goal of spiritual maturity. We did that back in the book of Hebrews when we did that. So James here refers to an individual who consistently does not stumble in word, as one who has reached a goal of spiritual maturity. Now, the third thing we see is that this one he's able to bridle the whole body as well. In other words, if you can control the tongue, which is the product of faith, and if faith can control the tongue, it can control everything else. It can rule everything else. So this mature person, this controlled person, can reign in his whole body to effectively restrain so sin cannot have its way. And the reference is to an exercise of self-control over the whole body. Man, if you can control your tongue, you can control the rest of you. And we'll see why shortly. Even teachers will stumble. But the thing is, even though they stumble, their lives must be generally characterized by a lack of stumbling, especially in the area of the tongue, in the realm of speech and in the realm of teaching. Now, the description of the tongue. And we see this in verses 3 to 12 of chapter 3, and we see the power of the tongue in chapter 3 to the first part of in verse 3 to the first part of verse 5. Now, if we put the horses' bridles into their mouths, that they may obey us, we turn about their whole body also. Now, verse 3, James, he starts off here with the example of a horse and bridle. You know, for those of you who don't know what a bridle is, the bridle or the bit, it's a small piece of metal that you place in the horse's mouth, and that's where you got to place it. It's the only place you can put it, and that controls the horse. The bridle's purpose is that the horse will obey the rider, but you know, this is only possible if the bit is placed in the proper place. I mean, you know, you can't put the bit under the horse's tail. That's not going to move the horse anywhere. The result is, if it's in the proper place, if it's in the mouth, we can turn the whole body around with that little bit in the mouth. And the Greek word here for turn about, it's used only here, and again, it's used in verse 4. It means to change the direction of. So with that one little bit in a big horse's mouth, we can control the whole body, the whole course of the horse. Behold the ships also, he goes on in verse 4, behold the ships also, though they are so great and are driven by rough winds, are yet turned about by a very small rudder, whither the impulse of the steersman wills. So here we have the second example that James draws on, which is the ship and the rudder. Again, behold, it's a special call to attention, and James uses it 6 times in his book. We see it in here in 3:4, and we see it in 5, and again we'll see it in chapter 5, verse 4, 7, 9, and 11. So he says the ships also, or more literally from the Greek, also the ships. So the expression also the ships connects this illustration with the previous one, with the tongue expressing the same point, trying to establish the same point. What they're trying to establish is the fact that a very small thing can direct very large things. Though they are great, which is the big ship, in contrast to this very small rudder, or even it's a big horse, this very small bridle. So though the ships are huge and are driven by rough winds, or Greek is violent winds, while horses have a will of their own, this ship hasn't got a will of its own. It's driven along by violent winds. And their ships are subject to nature from without. Yet, even though they're maneuvered from within by a very small rudder. And this rudder is very small compared to the larger ship, yet it controls the direction of the entire vessel. Jacob then states whether the impulse of the steersman wills. So the pilot or the captain who is the one who controls the rudder, he commands the entire ship. So what we have here is we have the guiding desire of the steersman or the pilot or the captain, and we have the means of control, which is the rudder, and that little rudder under the command of the steersman controls the whole ship. And we can look at this in this view. We can look at it this way. Human desire, if we turn to human desire, and then we have the tongue and the body. So the tongue can control the entire body under the direction of human desire. Something like that. Now, second part of verse 5, we have the application here. So the tongue also is a little member and boasts great things. So, like the bridle and the rudder, the tongue is also small compared to the whole body, yet this tongue achieves great results over the whole life. The expression where he says boasts great things in the Greek is 2 words, megala, which is great things, and ocheo, which means to lift up the neck. And this is what we're seeing here together. It boasts, this little tongue boasts great things. The tongue is the point here is that the tongue arrogantly proclaims its own exploits. It stirs up strife or provokes others. So just as a small thing can control a great thing, the control of the tongue will help to control the whole body. The bit in the mouth of the horse and the rudder command the direction of the horse and the ship. The tongue is what directs one's life towards spiritual maturity and rewards, or opposite to that, toward divine discipline and loss of rewards. So this little tongue can steer the course of life. And to demonstrate the destructiveness of the tongue, James now begins in the second part of verse 5 and verse 6 with the example of fire. Once again, he starts with behold, special call to attention, and then he questions, How much wood is kindled by how small a fire? Literally, the Greek word order is, behold what size fire, what size forest kindles. What they're saying here is that the smallest of sparks can still destroy a whole forest. And for those, well, for us here in Australia, we know that a simple tossed cigarette butt out the window can cause massive destruction here. Now, having given the example, James now comes to the application in verse 6. And the tongue is a fire. Literally saying, and yes, the tongue really is a fire. An uncontrolled fire is destructive. And as uncontrolled, the tongue is equally destructive. The world of iniquity among our members is the tongue, and the Greek word here for world is the cosmos, which emphasizes the world as an orderly system. The tongue is part of this vast system connected with iniquity. For the cosmos world is a world controlled by Satan. This domain in which we're aliens, we're passing through, is controlled by Satan. And in the Greek, iniquity is written with the definite article, and so it is the iniquity. It refers to the well-known forces of evil with which the believer is in constant conflict. And the Greek text here reads, the world of the iniquity. Now, as part of this vast system of iniquity among our members, the tongue is unique because no other part of the body has that range of possibility in causing evil. The tongue is unique. It has huge ability to cause evil, for there is no kind of evil at all which cannot be ignited in human life by this tiny little fire trap. And the Greek means the tongue constitutes or appoints itself. God does not do this. The tongue sets himself up as something great and big. He boasts great things. The tongue is a fire trap. And as a result, the tongue now defiles the whole body. An uncontrolled tongue is morally defiling. And the Greek word for defiles here, it's only used here and in Jude 23, and it refers to a moral stain. So that is the function and nature of the uncontrolled tongue. It defiles. It causes a moral stain, and wrongly used, the tongue pollutes man's whole personality. By corrupting or staining the whole person, the tongue destroys true religion, which James has already told us about. True religion requires that we keep ourselves from being polluted or stained by the world, and the tongue is the one that can defile. It defiles. It causes a moral stain on us. Now, the present world system of the cosmos, which is hostile to God, displays this hostility in the body through the tongue. And by permitting oneself, or by permitting itself, the tongue, to be used as an organ for sin, James adds, the tongue sets on fire the wheel of nature. Again, we have a definite article before the word nature. It is the wheel of the nature. And the Greek word here for wheel, it can mean wheel or course, a direction, and it's emphasizing a circular running. So the Greek word for nature can mean nature, but it can also mean birth or kin or existence, focusing on the course of life. This is what it here refers to. It refers to the entire wheel of human existence. So this wheel is set in motion at birth, and it continues throughout the whole life. And in this case, life's valued relationships are set ablaze by an uncontrolled tongue. I mean, how many How many family disputes have been going on for decades because of a harsh word that was said at a Christmas party or something like that? A slanderous report can incite a community, and propaganda can arouse a whole nation. Cast your mind back to Nazi propaganda. What did that accomplish? All those passionate nationalistic words of hatred can lead to riots, pogroms, genocide. This tongue can do all that. It's a destructive thing. It's very destructive. It's a fire trap. The tongue, which is a destructive fire, it's a fire set by hell. That's the source of an uncontrolled tongue. And the Greek word for hell, James uses it here. It's the word Gehenna. And that refers to the lake of fire and the second death. Now, this is the only time the word Gehenna is used outside the Gospels. Gehenna is the Hellenized form of two Hebrew words, which is Gay Hinnom, or the Valley of Hinnom. And in that valley, back in Jeremiah's day, Jeremiah 32:35, pagan child sacrifices were carried out there, and trash was often burned in it. Jesus used the word to refer to the place of ultimate condemnation. So the fire of the tongue is fed by the unending fires of hell, or better, Gehenna. And in the Greek, in a present passive participle, what he's saying here, it is habitually, the tongue is habitually set on fire by Gehenna, because the tongue consistently permits itself to be used by satanic evil. And therefore, it is set on fire by Gehenna. Now, this uncontrolled tongue, it has a connection with the unseen world of evil. And those who spread evil are the satanic forces of evil, which are destined for the lake of fire. An uncontrolled tongue can be a tool of Satan and demons in spreading the fires of hell. And one demonstrates membership in the world system by using his tongue to express evils in his heart, which in turn now defiles the whole body. So it starts from the inner desire, and it comes out through the tongue, and now it defiles the whole body. You know, we all would have viewed that childhood saying, "Sticks and stones may break my bones, but words will never hurt me." I mean, we would have all have spoken that at some time. That actually reverses the truth of the matter, because it is far easier to heal the wounds caused by sticks and stones than the damage caused by words. And we find this in the book of Proverbs, because the book of Proverbs tells us through thoughtless chattering, lying, arrogant boasting, gossiping, all these things can bring about terrible influences. Now, we see in verses 7 to 8 that the tongue is an untamable fire. It's untamable. For every kind of beast and birds, of creeping things and things in the sea is tamed and have been tamed by mankind. So, verse 7. James now contends that the animal kingdom can be tamed. And by beginning with the word for, again, this for word simply bridges the gap between verse 7 and verses 5 and 6. Now, he's not stating that every creature or every animal has been tamed by man. It just means, the Greek means here, the nature. Every animal nature has been tamed by man. So there is a distinctive natural characteristic that divides the animal world into its distinctive groups, and every category of animal, not necessarily every particular animal, has been tamed. And the categories are every kind or every nature. So the expression every kind or nature in this verse is based upon Genesis chapter 9, verse 2, where in Genesis we see that there are 4 categories of animals, and the kinds he mentions are beasts, which are animals that walk, birds are animals that fly, creeping things are animals that crawl, things in the sea, well, animals that swim. And the last phrase, those things in the sea, again, that's a word only used here. It's only used here in the Greek text. Now, this was a very common way of summarizing the non-human world, both in Jewish and Christian writings. Now, the expression is tamed does not mean to domesticate, but it means to subjugate or to subdue or to curb. It's a Greek word used only here and in Mark chapter 5, verse 4. And here it's in the present tense. So what we see here is that it is a fact repeatedly observed by mankind, you know, that the animal world can be tamed, can be subdued. The expression have been tamed, it's a perfect tense. It points out there that history authenticates the previous observation. So all categories are tamed and have been tamed by mankind. And the Greek here emphasizes the nature of humanity. Every nature of creatures of the animal world is open to control by human nature. So it emphasizes superiority of human nature over the four categories of animal nature, whether they walk, crawl, fly, swim, whatever. Now, while all four areas of the animal kingdom are tamed or are open to subjection by mankind, in verse 8, he declares, but the tongue can no man tame. The tongue is not tamed. And the word but here demonstrates a contrast. But the tongue, it's not like the animal world. The tongue is different. And it says can, which means in the present tense. He's calling attention to man's continual inability to tame the tongue. And when James writes no man, it means no exceptions. And the stress here is on the word man naturally. Now, there is actually one exception, Jesus the man, but that's not what James is saying. Every other man other than Jesus, the tongue cannot be tamed. And the Greek word here is anthropos, which is where we get the Greek anthropology. So we get anthropology, anthropomorphic, all denoting humanly. So what we're saying here is that humanity does not possess the capacity to tame the tongue. Even the greatest of God's servants, except Jesus, have failed to completely control their tongues. In fact, Moses, one of the greatest of all God's servants, he was excluded from the promised land because he spoke rashly with his lips. There we go. That thing that he said, it just changed his future. And we see that in Psalm 106, verse 33. Psalm 106, verse 33. So this incapacity, it's a moral inability. It is a weakness of the human will. And in the Greek text, the word man appears at the end of the phrase, basically reading, the tongue, which is the emphatic one, the tongue cannot be tamed by man. This meaning now opens the opportunity for God to do the taming. Because what man cannot do naturally, God can do supernaturally. And the word order in the Greek indicates that there is an exception. But the tongue, no one is able to subdue of men, humanly speaking. There is one that can control the tongue, someone other than man, that is God. The only way to control our tongue is supernaturally by the power of the Holy Spirit. Otherwise, the tongue is a restless evil. And James now points out two more characteristics of the tongue. First of all, it's a restless evil. And the Greek word for a restless evil also has the meaning of unstable. Now, this is the translation back in chapter 1, verse 8. Remember, chapter 1, verse 8, a double-minded man, unstable in all his ways. So the point here is that the tongue, it's fickle, it's inconsistent. And here in this verse, the definition is unruly or ungovernable. It's an instrument of wickedness. The tongue is incapable of being restrained, and it's always prone to break out in vicious words. And by calling it restless, James means that it is ever stirring and changing. It's eluding man's grasp, and it's thwarting all attempts to subdue it. It's as if the tongue has a mind of its own. But the tongue, it's like an untamed animal. It's pacing back and forth. It's ready to pounce on that which comes near. The nature of the tongue is evil. And the Greek word signifies it is base and degraded in character. Second characteristic, it is full of deadly poison. So the impact of the tongue is deadly. Literally, the Greek reads, it is death-bearing, and it's only used here. So the allusion here is to a deadly serpent, such as the one found in Psalm 58:4 and 104, verse 3. Now, one needs to remember that at all times that he carries in his mouth what could be compared to a poisonous snake, poisonous viper, and one can affect others in a way that even results in their death. For example, we see with the bullying, for instance, in schools, kids have taken their lives. We see, ridiculing a suicidal or a depressed person can cause loss of life. So one must be especially alert against its most disastrous eruptions. What do they say? Before you say anything, count to 10. Think about what you're going to say. We see the inconsistency of the tongue in verses 9 to 12 of chapter 3. Therewith bless we the Lord and Father, and therewith curse we men, who are made after the likeness of God. So James now explains in verses 9 to the first part of verse 10. He says that the same tongue can be the source of both blessing and cursing. Therewith bless we the Father, bless we the Lord and Father. And the word we, again, first person plural, it makes it true of mankind in general. We, humanity in general, we bless God in general. The blessing of God was a basic part of, remember, James is writing to Jews here. So, to them, the blessing of God was a basic part of their Jewish devotion. They would say, the Holy One, blessed be he. It's one of the most common designations of God in rabbinic literature. So the blessing of God, of course, that's the highest use of the tongue. And the Greek word for bless translates to speak well or of, or to extol. And when used of God, it means to celebrate his name and act with praise towards him. Calling him Lord and Father, it's a very unique New Testament praise. By calling him Lord, it emphasizes God's authority and sovereignty. By addressing him as Father, it emphasizes God's love and compassion. But James goes on, he says, but also with the tongue, therewith curse we men. So by using we, James means this is also true of mankind in general. Again, James is highlighting the double-minded man trying to please both God and the world. To curse means to wish someone ill will. Now, James could choose no stronger contrast to illustrate the inconsistency of the tongue than its use in praising God, the highest form, and in cursing human beings, which is the lowest form. So if praising God is one of the highest forms, then obviously cursing men is one of the lowest forms. And we curse men, though man was created after the likeness of God. Man was created in the image of God. And the Greek word for created, for made here, is in a perfect, for made is in a perfect tense, teaching that the image was not totally obliterated in the fall. Every one of us still has the image of God within us. So it's exemplifying man in his present state. Even the non-believer still has sufficient of the image of God in him. Sin marred man's image, but did not destroy it. And because of the image of man is contained within man, man is a personal, rational, and moral being who possesses the attributes of reason, will, and conscience. Therefore, he has the ability to know and to serve God. He has a capacity to be conformed to God's moral and spiritual likeness. In effect, when one curses another man who is made in the image of God, he is also issuing a curse against God as well. And this is the low use of the tongue. Now, cast your mind back to the Gospels, for instance. Jesus forbid his disciples from cursing others. Indeed, they were to bless those who curse you. And you can find it in Luke chapter 6, verse 24. Also, you can find it in Romans 12:14. Luke 6:28, Romans 12:14. The rabbis had a similar concept. Rabbis would say, one should not say, let my neighbor be put to shame, for then you put to shame the one who is in the image of God. What they're saying is, we are all created in the image of God. Therefore, don't say anything to put your neighbor to shame, because you're then casting aspersions upon God. So in verse 10, James states, out of the same mouth comes forth blessing and cursing. Now, here's inconsistency. In the Greek, the emphasis here is on the same. Out of the same mouth comes forth blessing and cursing. Now, Jesus also pointed out to the seriousness of what comes out of the mouth by making it a standard of judgment. He says in Matthew 12:37, by your words you will be acquitted, and by your words you'll be condemned. So this cursing here in verse 10 is declared in verse 10, the second part of verse 10b, to be sin. And by writing, my brethren, he indicates this inconsistency is found among believers, and therefore rebukes. He says these things ought not so to be. And the Greek word for ought is found only in this verse, and it emphasizes fitness or congruity. This is a moral abnormality. These things shouldn't be like this. Why? Because this is a moral abnormality. Believers who have been transformed by the Spirit of God should manifest the wholeness and purity of the heart in consistency and purity of speech. Such inconsistency is unique, as we see in verses 11 to 12. In verse 11, the fountain or the spring is used as an example. And he asks the question, does the fountain send forth from the same opening sweet water and bitter? Well, it demands a negative answer. Surely it doesn't. No way. The fountain or spring does not have the capacity to simultaneously produce both types of water. And the Greek for send forth appears only here. It's a word that refers to something full to bursting. The word sweet points to the water being clear and drinkable, while the word bitter emphasizes the water as brackish or salty. It's undrinkable. No spring or water is this consistent at any time. And in verse 12, James uses nature in his next example. Nature cannot yield something unnatural to it. Can a fig tree, my brethren, yield olives, or a vine figs? So these are questions all demanding a negative answer. Orchards and vineyards are not so inconsistent. Fig trees do not produce olives. Vines do not produce figs. Neither can salt water yield sweet. And the Greek word for salt functions here as an adjective meaning salty. The idea that salt or salt water could produce fresh water makes no sense. Bad things don't produce good things. And his point here is that nature is very consistent. And in verse 13, we have the proof of wisdom. James begins with the question, who is wise and understanding among you? So now this query was issued and intended as a call for self-examination. The phrase wise and understanding is the only New Testament usage of these two words paired together. They're commonly used in the Old Testament. We see them in Deuteronomy 1:3, 4, 6, and Hosea 14:9. The Greek word for wise means to possess moral insight, which refers to having the skill in deciding practical issues of conduct. And I already taught back in chapter 1:6, remember we're to ask in faith of God for wisdom. So wisdom can be derived from God and involves practical aspects of knowledge. The Greek word for understanding is used only in this verse, and it refers to the knowledge of an expert. So the ability of a specialist applying fuller knowledge to a specific situation. It's a word used of the intellectual and the professional individual. So if there are any wise and understanding among you characterized by these two categories, James declares, let him show by his good life and his works in meekness of wisdom. Double emphasis here. First emphasis is that the true test of wisdom is not words, but works of a good life. Wisdom is not measured by degrees, but by deeds. It's not a matter of acquiring truth in Bible studies or lectures, but it's a matter of applying truth to life. Wisdom must be proved by works, just like faith, which was his point back in chapter 2, verses 14 to 26. And this imperative here indicates an effective demonstration by his good life. It's continuously being done. And the word for life here refers to a life of movement and action. The Greek word for good means noble or beautiful. It's attractive. Works, not words, is a test of wisdom. Second emphasis is the meekness of wisdom. And here it is closely related to humility, patience, and love. But here the emphasis is on humility. It denotes a gentleness or a submissiveness and mildness, which is the opposite of arrogance and self-assertiveness. So instead of boldly and arrogantly verbalizing the wisdom they thought they possessed, James' readers are challenged to demonstrate it by their lifestyle in that gentle spirit of meekness, which was always a mark of true wisdom. The truly wise man is humble. The concept of wisdom in Greek had to do with a high degree of abstract philosophical knowledge. But in Jewish thinking, wisdom dealt with practical moral insight based upon the knowledge of God and his word. It had to do with practical advice on practical issues of conduct. You know, James, he's a Jew, so he's using wisdom in its Jewish concept, not in its Greek concept of simply accumulating in some abstract knowledge. That's not wisdom. In the Jewish concept, wisdom is using that information for practical advice on practical issues. But if you have bitter jealousy and faction in your heart, glory not and lie not against the truth. So here, false wisdom is the result of an untamable tongue. In verse 14, James lists three evidences of earthly wisdom. But if you have the three things, first up, bitter jealousy or envy. This is a word that means to begrudge others of their successes. You're having a resentful and harsh attitude. Second, we have faction in your heart, and this refers to factionalism, including strife, rivalry, and selfish ambition. It means to advance one's own selfish interests in an unethical manner. And then we have something in your heart, because the heart is the source of moral action. The third evidence now is glory not and lie against the truth. The word glory means to boast against or gloating over another, to be arrogant, to be assuming superiority. The expression lie not against the truth contains the definite article the. So that's to do with the truth. It is the truth, and it refers to the gospel truth. So maintaining these qualities results in lying against the truth, living a life that does not agree with God's truth. Therefore, false wisdom evolves from this moral condition, which itself was originally caused by an untamable tongue. And then in verse 15, James deals with the source of false wisdom, and he states it negatively. This wisdom is not a wisdom that comes from above. This wisdom, that is, the false wisdom described in verse 14, is not a wisdom that comes from above, in contrast to what he wrote back in chapter 1, verse 17, where he says that every good and perfect gift is from above, from the Father of lights. This kind of wisdom is not of a heavenly source. Now, stated positively, this wisdom is earthly, it is sensual and devilish. Earthly means it is earthbound. Worldly, it's not from God or from heaven, but it's from men. And the word sensual just tells us it is natural. It is arising out of man's fallen nature. Same word is used in 1 Corinthians 2:14 to describe the natural man who cannot understand spiritual concepts. Sensual is also used in Jude 19 of a person who does not have the Holy Spirit. So by depicting wisdom as devilish, demonic, James means demonical. It's used as adjective. It's characterizing that it's proceeding from an evil spirit. That's where it's coming from. It appears only in this verse, nowhere else. So false wisdom originates from the world, the flesh, and the devil. And they are the three fronts of spiritual warfare. We'll just, in verse 16, James explains the results of false wisdom. And again, the word for connects this verse with the previous verses 14 and 15. It provides here the reason for the problems of verse 14, where jealousy and factions are. There is confusion in every vile deed. Word confusion means it's a commotion, or it's a chaos. It's a tumultuous anarchy. Back in chapter 1, verse 8, this word was used to describe the result of being double-minded. In chapter 3, verse 8, it was the result of an uncontrolled tongue. Now, here it refers to sinful actions, and the expression vile deeds has a reference to all forms of evil, especially moral evil. And the results of false wisdom, it's disorder and sinfulness. So basically, in the local church where there is jealousy and factions, the church is then thrown into turmoil, and evil things are said and done which have no place in the Christian fellowship. And so the work of Satan now becomes unmistakable. It's 11:01. We might leave it here for today. So yeah, we leave it here for today. Thank you all for coming along. Study hard and grow strong. Thank you.